Today we're happy to welcome back our friend, Kate Quinn, who I think has the record for Lunch with Books appearances, much like Steve Martin has Saturday Night Live's record. She's here to tell us about the Sultana Disaster. Here she is, Kate Quinn.
I am so amazed that there's so many people here. But before I begin, I want to start with some thank yous. First of all, to my editor and a technical assistant. I always thank her, but I don't explain to you how many hours she spends making this look good, or rather, making me look good. So thank you, Jean. Also, I want to thank the library. We have the most vibrant, alive facility of any that I've visited. At least twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week, because not having a book to read to me is like not having food. Yeah, I have to, and today I had to ask Nan upstairs at the service at the front desk to recommend something because I've read everything I could think of. And the reference librarian, when I give her a list of books to get in her library, they just go and buy them. You know, I was so amazed, so I thanked Amy for that, and she said that if you have suggestions of books that you think the library should own, just to let her know. Now, what other library in the world is as wonderful as this one? I mean, they're welcoming, they're friendly, they're helpful. We are just blessed. But I would like to see everybody in this room send a letter to the editor or a letter to the city councils to do something about the parking. Because it's just not fair. We could have more people here. I'm sure more people would come if they didn't have to walk 3 blocks, and some people can't. So if you would do that for me, I would appreciate it very much. I love this library. Okay, the Sultana Disaster. They were on their way home. For years they had endured starvation and slept on the cold ground in the prisons of the South, and now at last they were coming back to their families. The war was over, Lincoln had been assassinated less than 2 weeks before, and his funeral train was traveling from Washington, D.C. to Illinois. So news of America's worst maritime disaster barely made the headlines. In fact, was buried in the back pages of the paper. The prison camps at Andersonville and Cahaba were even worse than Dachau and Auschwitz in their primitive conditions. Cahaba, also known as Castle Morgan, was an old cotton warehouse, and it had only 432 bunks. And at its peak, the camp held 2,100 men. The only available water was contaminated with runoff from the privies, and the prisoners cooked their one meal a day over a small campfire. The stench of the smoke, mixed with the odor from the privies, was almost unbearable. Men stood in line to haul out the dead each day, knowing that their reward would be a brief breath of fresh air. Andersonville, or Camp Sumter, as it was known, was built with slave labor and by Union prisoners to hold 10,000 men. At its peak in 1864, it had 30,000 men. Of that number, 5,000 died of malnutrition, exposure, and disease. As you can see from this picture, it looks a lot better than there's no cover for those men. They didn't have shelter to sleep under. They slept on the cold ground. That's wall-to-wall men at the prison. Many were wounded Union soldiers whose injuries went untreated. The stream that ran through the prison provided the only source of drinking and fresh water, so soon became contaminated. By the end of the war, prisoners were marched to Vicksburg to be sent by steamboat upriver to their homes. Of those that traveled on the Sultana, 652 were from Ohio, 463 from Tennessee, 407 from Indiana, 274 from Michigan, 185 from Kentucky, and few from other states, and 19 from West Virginia. The Sultana was a side-wheeler built in Cincinnati in 1863 for the lower Mississippi cotton trade. She was registered at 1,700 tons and carried a crew of 85. Her maiden voyage was to Wheeling, West Virginia. Her regular run was from New Orleans to St. Louis, and she had frequently carried Army personnel up and down the river. Her smokestacks were so tall that I don't think she could get under the suspension bridge, and that's why she only came as far as Wheeling. On April 21st, 1865, the Sultana left New Orleans carrying 75 to 100 passengers, a cargo which included 100 hogshead of sugar and 100 head of assorted livestock. By law, she could only carry 376 people, including her crew. Her captain was J.C. Mason of St. Louis, who had a reputation as a good and careful riverman. Her chief engineer was Nathan Whitringer of Steubenville, Iowa. By the time she reached Vicksburg, it was discovered that the boilers were leaking badly. It was decided to tie up there, and the repair crew quickly fixed the problem with patches. A temporary fix, but it felt they would hold until the Sultana got to her final destination of Cincinnati, Ohio. Meanwhile, the prisoners were transported to Camp Fisk, just outside of Vicksburg. You can see where Vicksburg is there. General Dana, the Union commander, gave the telegram authorizing the release of prisoners to his second-in-command, Captain Speed, who was appointed the Commissioner of Exchange. Now came the entry of the villain of the piece, Colonel Reuben Hatch, who had been court-martialed for shady deals he had profited from using government money. His brother-in-law was a friend of Lincoln's and soon had the charges dropped. But with his title of Chief Quartermaster of the Department of Mississippi, he was able to continue his underhanded dealings. Hatch went to see Captain Mason of the Sultana and assured him that there would be a load of prisoners for him when he reached Vicksburg. The captain got $3 per head, and Hatch got $2 per head. Good money was to be made both by the quartermaster agent and the captain in fulfilling the government contract to transport the prisoners, and there was no doubt that Speed profited from the overloading of the steamer Sultana. Other steamers sat idly by and empty as they watched the Sultana load. It was decided that listing the men as they came on board would take too long. So it was decided that it would be sorted out after they were all on board and after they left Vicksburg. Meanwhile, the prisoners jostled and pushed to get aboard the steamer. The men were in high spirits and sang, shouted, and jested as they struggled to find a place on the decks to call their own. Every available space was filled, including the pilot house. Those who claimed space near the boilers felt that the warmth would be a blessing. The final figures of just how many men were on board is sketchy, but was between 1,800 and 2,000. All the figures for this disaster, no one knows accurately exactly how many people were on board, especially the prisoners. Captain Mason cautioned the men not to crowd to one side of the boat, as that could cause her to take on water. Now, when they were leaving Vicksburg, they knew their picture was being taken. They all came to one side of the boat, and it started to tip a bit, so the captain got a little panicky. The Mississippi was in full flood, and many towns along the river were underwater. For 2 or 3 miles on both sides of the river, the water covered the land, leaving only a few treetops exposed. Making a few stops along the way, the Sultana crept north, docking at Memphis on April 26, 1865. The hogsheads of sugar were unloaded, a few passengers disembarked, and many of the soldiers went ashore to see the sights, and some did not make it back to the boat by sailing time. While in Memphis, a leaky boiler again began to give more trouble, and the repair crews were called out. Finally, at midnight, the Sultana crossed the river to load up on coal, and the paddle wheel strained against the strong current of the flooded river. And there was a man from St. Louis who claimed to have, he was a Confederate. He claimed he put a bomb in the coal, and then made sure that that coal was loaded onto the boat. There's no evidence to support this claim. 200 steamships blew up on the Mississippi, and after the Sultana, 26 blew up, so this guy took credit for 20 of them, and I think he was kidding himself, or a daydreamer or something. Just as the steamer rounded the bend north of Memphis near the Hen and Chickens Islands at 2 a.m., the boilers exploded. The noise was heard back in Memphis. The flames could also be seen in Memphis, and the ship USS Grosbeak, a river gunboat, cast off its mooring lines and steamed to the rescue. Hundreds of soldiers were killed outright by the explosion of the 3 boilers. Hundreds more were sent hurtling from the Sultana into the dark, cold waters of the Mississippi, many not knowing what happened or how they ended up in the water. Charles Eldridge of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry found a place to sleep on the pitch-covered hurricane deck. He said, "I was sound asleep when this happened, waking up while flying through the air, whirling over and over. After fighting his way to the surface, he started to swim for land when he spotted a ladder floating nearby. Clinging to the ladder were 2 men who had taken care of Eldridge while he was a prisoner. Weakened by their stay in the prisons, and most were unable to swim, many died. One man recalled afterward, "When I got about 300 yards away from the boat, clinging to a heavy plank, the whole heavens seemed to be lighted up by the conflagration. Hundreds of my comrades were fastened down by the timbers of the decks and had to burn while the water seemed to be one solid mass of human beings struggling with the waves. Fire followed the explosion. The blast scattered hot coals from the furnaces all over the midship section of the steamer, and in moments the disabled vessel was on fire. The upper works were all collapsed. There was a huge gaping hole in the middle of the hurricane deck, and flames were everywhere. Aboard the Sultana had been a large crate containing a rather large alligator, which was sort of a mascot to the crew. So as the burning boat threatened their lives, passengers had no choice but to jump into the water, with the added fear that this alligator was probably among them. But one enterprising man stabbed the alligator with his bayonet, confiscated the crate for a boat, and made it into the river until it was rescued by a passing boat. I could easily recount the many dreadful stories told by survivors, but that would spoil your reading of the great books on the subject. So instead, I'm going to recount the stories of the men, wheeling men, some of whom lived to tell their tales of that horrible experience, and some who didn't. I'll talk about the books that I recommend on this subject, but the one that I particularly like, Jean found online. It's free. It's under Google Books. It's called The Smoked Yam. And it's not about the Sultana as much as it's about life in the prisons. So that's one of the rather moving books, startling books, I should say. Okay, Anthony Craig was a tailor in Wheeling. He had 4 children, and he enlisted when he was 44, then re-enlisted in Battery D, 1st West Virginia Light Artillery in 1864, and he listed his age as 37. He drowned after the explosion of the Sultana. William Crudis was from Newcastle, England. He was naturalized in Wheeling in 1848 and listed his occupation as a teamster. He enlisted on March 12, 1864, but apparently didn't appear for service. He was arrested and imprisoned in the Athenaeum, then sent to his unit on March 13th. He was captured near Lynchburg and sent to Andersonville. According to an article in the Memphis Argus dated April 28, 1865, William Crudis was, quote, picked up while almost in the agonies of death. He was holding to the limb of a partially submerged tree with such force that the limb had to be cut before they could get his body onto a raft. He was taken by a local man to his house, but died before he could reach the hospital. He was wearing an identification label, which someone must have written for him, as he was only able to sign his enlistment papers with an X. Among the lucky survivors was Henry C. Foster. He was a brickmaker. His father was well known in Wheeling as the stagecoach agent and held that position until the coming of the railroad to Wheeling in 1852. While home on furlough, he married Margaret Boring, whose father was a close friend of his. He was captured at the Battle of Newmarket and sent to Andersonville. He was rescued 5 hours after the explosion. After the war, he took Sarah Jones as his wife, without divorcing his first wife. He applied for a war pension in January of 1886 and stated, "I incurred scurvy about 3 months after the time I was captured, from want of proper food and exposure while in prison." He went on to say that he was presently working as a carpenter, but he incurred debility or weakness of the whole system, which he blamed on both the imprisonment and the disaster. He was denied the pension, and he died in 1890 of pneumonia, and he's buried in Mount Wood Cemetery. His widow, Sarah, applied for the pension, and in a statement by a fellow officer, it was reported that he, quote, he had married Dot Boring when she was known as a common prostitute. He further stated that he must have been drunk or crazy to have married that woman, and that he had been robbed of his money, and he charged her and her father with the same. He said while he was in the service that he would never live with that woman. A statement from Dot Boring Foster said she was 14 when she married Henry, and that her father told her that Henry had, quote, nursed me when I was a child. I have no idea what that means. I think it means he was her babysitter, but yeah, she was 14, though, so it's a little strange. Sarah was denied the pension. George C. Loy was yet another Wheeling survivor of the Sultana. He served with Carlin's Battery and was captured at Hanging Rock Gap in Virginia in 1864 and sent to Andersonville. After the war, he worked as a blacksmith and machinist at the Bel Air nail mill, but dismissed from his job for intemperance. He had a paralytic stroke in 1872, and he was treated for delirium tremens, a symptom of alcoholic abuse. He was only 35 when he died, and he's buried at Mount Wood. In a letter home from Camp Parole, that's what he called it, it was actually Camp Fisk, dated April 1865, George wrote, "We have had a hard time with the Confederacy and suffered everything that man could possibly do, from hunger, cold, and thirst, and since last month, 1 year ago, there has died in Andersonville Stockade Prison alone 13,000 Union men." George Loy jumped into the water after the explosion on the Sultana and spent about 3.5 hours in the water before being rescued. He was unconscious and was taken to Washington Hospital in Memphis. From there, he wrote his family, "Everything was confused. Hundreds were blown high in the air and came down burned and mangled beyond description. Men were seen tying life preservers around their wives and children and throwing them overboard in hopes of their being saved. Around the boat in the water was a mass of human beings, some in their death struggles, drowning, others who otherwise might have reached shore. The screams and groans of men, women, and children on that ill-fated boat I shall never forget." George mentioned a slight wound from a piece of wood as a result of the explosion, but later the letter in which he wrote this was changed to read a severe wound. And a tube was placed before the 3.5 hours that he spent in the water. He was treated for a stroke, a rheumatism of his left side. He died in 1877. His widow was denied the pension. Alexander Manners, which is 22 when he enlisted in the fall of 1861. He was captured at the Battle of Newmarket in May of 1864 and sent to Andersonville. He died as a result of the explosion. James McHenry's residence in Wheeling can only be assumed from his site of enlistment in Company G of the 1st Regiment of West Virginia Light Artillery in Wheeling in May of 1861. He was a blacksmith and toolmaker. At Salem, Virginia, now West Virginia, in January of 1863. He was injured by an explosion of a caisson full of ammunition. He was hurled against a tree and taken to Grafton Hospital, where he remained for 4 months. When released, he re-enlisted, this time with Battery D, 1st West Virginia Light Artillery. He was captured at Hunter's Raid on Lynchburg, Virginia, and sent to Andersonville. When the Sultana exploded, he suffered injuries to his bones, limbs, a fractured skull, left temple, right shoulder, and arm. He was at Washington Hospital in Memphis for 2 months, was discharged in Clarksburg, and moved to Chicago, where he lived in the Soldiers' Home. His pension application was dropped when he died in 1893. Theophilus Richardson was captured near Petersburg while assisting a comrade whose horse had fallen, fracturing his collarbone. This occurred in January of 1864. Theo escaped the enemy and waded across the river at Moorefield, West Virginia, but was recaptured. He was sent to Belle Isle and then Andersonville. He survived the explosion. He spent 3 hours in the freezing water, and he died in 1873. A pension for his 5 children was approved at a rate of $8 per month. Now, the average salary was $1 a day, so 5 children, $8 a month, didn't go far. George Smith was a machinist with Hobbs Taylor and Company in Wheeling, and then trained as a steamboat engineer on the boat Ben Franklin. He lived with his sister's family prior to enlisting in Carlin's Battery. He signed up for a 3-month enrollment and drove wagons of supplies from Webster to troops in Beverly, Virginia. He suffered a fractured skull when hit by flying debris during the boiler explosion on the Sultana, and he was in the water for 5 hours before being rescued. George was granted a pension and lived until 1912. Alan Stevens was employed by the Composition Roofing Company of Wheeling before joining up for a 3-month stint at the age of 19. When his 3 months were up, he enrolled in Carlin's Battery. Taken prisoner at Winchester, he was paroled and hospitalized off and on for the next year after being shot in the foot. Doesn't say who shot him. Maybe he shot himself, maybe it was the enemy, maybe he had somebody do it for him, who knows. He was again captured in 1864 and taken to Andersonville. He did not survive the Sultana disaster. Zachary Taylor Woodyard was only 16 when he joined the Army, and he was captured only 4 days later. Can you imagine? You're 16 years old, you join the Army, 4 days later you're a prisoner. He was a prisoner at Libby Prison, just one of the worst, in Richmond, Belle Isle, and finally Andersonville, where he contracted scurvy, rheumatism, and catarrh. Catarrh, I think, is their name for pneumonia. He was given a job in the cookhouse at the prison, which probably saved his life. He survived the explosion and went on to testify at the trial of James Duncan, a Confederate who had given him a job in the cookhouse. Now, let me say, although not on the Sultana, one of the most interesting stories of all is that of James Duncan, who had been a baker in Wheeling before moving to Louisiana, where he enlisted in the 5th Louisiana Infantry. Duncan was appointed to be the baker for the Andersonville prison. Bakery was located outside the stockade. He searched out and found many prisoners from Wheeling. He gave them work in the bakery plus extra rations. After the war, he was accused of murdering a prisoner, feeding rations to his hogs, and stealing packages from home intended for the prisoners. The trial took place in Savannah, Georgia in 1866, and 5 ex-prisoners from Wheeling went to testify on his behalf. The identity of the murdered man was never found, yet Duncan was found guilty of most of the charges and sentenced to 15 years hard labor at Fort Pulaski. Now, first of all, he didn't have any hogs. They never figured out who this guy he was supposed to have murdered was. And I've been to Fort Pulaski. It's a very interesting fort. It's got a moat with alligators in it. Obviously, the judge was prejudiced against a northerner who had aided and abetted the prisoners from his hometown. 16 people, including Daniel Lamb, one of Wheeling's prominent men, signed a petition to President Andrew Johnson asking for the release of Duncan, to no avail. Duncan himself wrote to the president stating that his family, wife, mother-in-law, and 4 children were suffering intense hardship without his support. Again, his pleas went unanswered. On July 11, 1867, Duncan escaped the prison with the help of former prisoners that he had befriended, and he moved to Philadelphia with his family. I think he couldn't come back here to Wheeling because he would have been rearrested. Government investigation of the explosion exonerated Captain Speed and all others except Hatch, who refused to testify and was blamed but never charged. Survivors of the Sultana met regularly at reunions in Ohio, and there's a monument to the Ohio men in Mansfield, Ohio. Some may dispute that the Sultana was the worst maritime disaster in history and ask about the Titanic. There were a few similarities in the two disasters. The Titanic hit the iceberg at 2:20 a.m. and the boilers blew on the Sultana at 2 a.m. But Titanic was a much larger boat, 882 feet long, compared to 260 feet of the Sultana. The Titanic carried the rich and famous of the world, whereas the Sultana carried destitute soldiers, weakened and exhausted from their ordeal in prison. Both vessels carried about the same number of passengers. The Sultana between 2,250 and 2,300, and the Titanic at 2,223. A rescue vessel saved 706 people from the Titanic, while 786 were saved from the Sultana. More than 200 people from the Sultana died after the rescue, which resulted in the percentage of dead approaching 75%, compared with the 68% who died as a result of the Titanic disaster. Since most of the victims of the tragedy were from the Midwest and the newspapers were mostly in the East, the story of the Sultana was generally ignored. Thus ends the tale of America's most worst maritime disaster and one of the saddest chapters in history. Now, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but there's a man in the audience, would you put your hand up, who gave me this. He has a relative who survived, right?
Yes.
Who survived the Sultana, who lived in West, he lived on the island, and he lived in West Wheeling. Is there anybody else in the audience who has a relative that they know of that was on the Sultana? Okay, I'd like to see the hands of the people that have heard of this disaster before today or before. Oh, I'm amazed, because not many people know about this. The books, this is Linda Fluharty's book. She did a lot of research at the National Archives on the Wheeling Men. I don't know, does the library have that?
We have it somewhere, I can't find it right now.
Okay.
It should be in the...
This one is the one I recommend. This is Gene Salaker's copy, Disaster on the Mississippi. The library does have this one. It's really interesting. The new book, you hold up that new book, Gene? No, the one next to it.
Right next.
Yeah, that's a new book that I was surprised 3/4 of it is about the prison life, but the stories are mesmerizing. Only the last part of the book is about the Sultana, but I could go on and on and on telling you stories from these books and from online of eyewitness accounts about what the men had to say. Their clothes were blown off, so they were naked in April in a flooded river. Some were lucky enough to be able to get to treetops and stay there for 2 or 3 hours until they were rescued. If there was such a thing in 1865 of post-traumatic stress, these men had it. But it wasn't recognized then, and you can see how many of them were denied the pension. But imagine seeing people burned to death in front of your eyes or drowned, maybe even because of you. You overloaded a plank or a box or a door or whatever they had to float on. The things these men had to live with afterwards were just horrendous. And I think they all probably had post-traumatic stress syndrome. It was an interesting read and voyage suggested to me by Carson Cox of the Civil War Roundtable, who loaned me these books, and then I read a lot more interesting books. I recommend that it's a story that I think everyone here would enjoy. I have always avoided reading about these prisons because I knew how gruesome the stories were. I didn't want to know. But in reading them, I learned an awful lot about what human beings can do when they want to survive. They want to get back to their families so badly. I gave this talk last night to the Civil War Roundtable, and somebody asked me why the men went on the boat when there were 2 empty boats on either side of it. You know, would you have protested and said, no, I'm not going on that boat, it's got too many men on it? Or would you have gone because you wanted to see your family and get home and forget about the war? And that's another reason why I think this was ignored in the newspapers, is because people were so sick of war. They didn't want to read anymore about people dying, especially after the war had ended. They wanted to celebrate the end of that war. We just lost our president, which was much more traumatic to them than the loss of thousands of men on the Mississippi. But it's a very interesting story, and one that I think we all need to remember the contribution that these men made. Is there anybody that has any questions? Yep.
Was there any kind of formal, you kind of indicated, was there a formal inquest or by the government, or was it just by
There
state
was,
authority?
but it was sort of a cover-up. It was a useless exercise in nonsense, because the government had hired this boat. The men, Hatch, who profited from putting so many men on board, he was the only one charged. There were others that were responsible, that outranked him and should have said, no, we're not going to put thousands of men on a boat when there's 2 empty ones side by side. We're not going to do that. But nobody said no. They just let it go ahead. Now, the official inquiry afterwards said that the boilers were dry. Well, John Bowman, who's an expert on steamboats, says that that this was a fault of design, that the pipes from the boilers were faulty in design, and they would get dry. And once they were dry, then it was easier to explode. I think the government should have held more people accountable, and I think they should have paid some pensions. It definitely needed further looking into, and it never got that, Harold. It just was rather shabby, I think, in investigation. There were actually two investigations. Yep. Any more questions?
I have a comment. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that Andersonville was comparable to some of the concentration camps. And I've just finished reading a book about Auschwitz. And I have no doubt that the conditions there compared with Auschwitz, but we forget that Auschwitz was an extermination camp.
Yeah, this is true.
I would recommend that book.
But wouldn't you consider it an extermination camp when 159 men a day were dying of disease?
Certainly.
That's an extermination camp to me.
Well, yeah, it worked out that way.
First of all, you usually didn't get captured unless you were wounded. And if you were wounded and sent to Andersonville, your wound was never treated. You never got to see a doctor. Well, or if you did, it was superficially. So you've got this wound, you're not getting enough food, your water's polluted, you're living in exposed conditions with no shelter, on the ground, and the smell must have just been horrendous. Just horrendous. So to me, that's an extermination camp. I'd rather go to Auschwitz, I think. I don't know. It's a
I don't know
horrible
about
thing to
that.
say.
At Auschwitz, it was planned to be that way. I don't know that they planned to kill those men.
Well, actually, the good news is that the man who was in charge of Andersonville was tried and convicted. So,
That's good.
yeah, he was held accountable afterwards, but not many others were dealt.
The comparison is still faulty in that Auschwitz was part of a grand plan to deliver.
Can you hear that in the back? Mel says that Auschwitz was part of a grand plan, and he's absolutely correct in that. Yeah. And
People
this-
died in Andersonville by default,
Yeah,
and that's a
That's a
fundamental
different
difference.
thing.
So I think the analogy is really flawed.
yeah. Harold?
The commander at Andersonville, of course, was a Swiss citizen originally. If he'd been a Native American, they probably would have put him on trial and hanged him as a war criminal. Weiss or Weiss, his name was. Wirtz. Wirtz. But if he'd been a Native American, they probably wouldn't have tried him, but I think they bowed to the American public and killed a foreigner.
Yeah,
He was the only Confederate person who was convicted and hanged after the war for war crimes. I mean, none of the generals, not Jefferson Davis, none of those people were tried and hanged. He was the only one. Of course, rightfully so, but you think others would have met that fate as well.
I think too that the president not pardoning James Duncan was horrible. And I think it was probably because he had joined the Confederacy and no other reason. Never mind that he had saved the lives of so many willing men. I mean, he didn't care about that. And he should have been pardoned. It's a shame that well, at least I'm sure that they knew that he had escaped and moved to Philadelphia. And I think they just sort of decided to leave him alone. Yep.
But did he deliberately move from Wheeling to Louisiana because of the war, or was that just by happenstance that he moved south and then the war broke?
Yeah, he moved south and then the war began. Chuck?
You mentioned so many of these soldiers who did not get pensions. In your reading, have you read anything about the reasons for not awarding pensions to people who served and maybe were wounded?
I don't think the government had a lot of money after the war. I think it's as plain and simple as that. And they never give a reason for denial. Except in that one case of George Lloyd, was it, that where they said he was basically a drunkard. Well, he was a drunkard because he had post-traumatic stress syndrome, but then they didn't see things that way. And I don't think the government had the money. I mean, you think about the number of men that served, that their wives and mothers would have applied for pensions. There wasn't enough money to go around. And $8 a month wouldn't go very far if you did get a pension. So it's a sorry scene.
In the course of your talk, you mentioned a book, I think you said it was available online. What was the title?
It's called The Smoked Yank.
The Smoked Yank. And the origin of the title is this was a Union soldier who was captured, I believe he was at Cahaba. And as Kate mentioned, they had to cook their own meals in there and had no way to clean themselves. And so they would get dirty from the smoke and so forth. And so his nickname was the Smoked Yank, and he kind of adopted that.
It's not a very long book. It took me a couple of hours to read it online, and you Google it, it's free, and it's interesting. Yep.
It's a whole, another possibility for exploration, maybe at another time. But I'm just curious as to what prevailing conditions were like in Union prisoner of war camps for Confederate soldiers.
The only one that I know anything at all about, actually, is the one in Columbus, Ohio, Camp Chase. Camp Chase, yeah.
Also in Elmira, New York, and there is a book about that. And conditions were not good, but they weren't as bad as the Confederate ones, I understand. But keep in mind also that in the Confederacy, they didn't have enough food to feed themselves even. So, but that's still no excuse for the conditions.
Yeah.
I think Camp Douglas was outside Chicago too, which a lot
Yes,
of Confederates
that's right.
died in.
I've read about that.
The winters in Chicago aren't very good, even though they gave them shelters. There were large gaps in the boards of the huts that they were in, so a lot of Confederates died.
I think that the Union was a lot more cooperative in exchanging prisoners than the South was.
But later in the war, they did not, because there were implications of exchanging for the black soldiers.
That's true.
And they would not, the South refused to do that, and so Lincoln said, we're not going to exchange anymore.
She's right. I remember reading that. Any more questions?
Yeah.
Jacob?
Could you tell us about your relative?
He was my great-grandfather. He was born in basically Bridgeport, Ohio. He was in the 50th Ohio, Company F. He was captured at Franklin, Tennessee, sent to Cahaba Prison. He caught the Sultana at Camp Biscuit, Vicksburg. He survived. He's buried in Riverview Cemetery in Martins Ferry, Iowa, and at the bottom of his marker it has Sultana survived.
And what was his name?
And I have all his letters. Thomas D. Moore.
Now, were they letters from prison or letters after?
I have letters from Cahaba Prison.
You do?
Yeah, one.
Yeah.
We'd like to see
I
those.
have the letter his tent mate wrote when he was captured. I have a letter from Cahaba Prison, several from Camp Biscuit in Vicksburg.
Do you have a photograph of him?
On the island, he had a confectioner, a later photograph. I don't have any period photos.
Becca, did you see him?
Anybody else? Yeah, Judy?
Did you say where the Sultana was built and who built it?
It was built in Cincinnati. I can't remember the name of the company that built it. Yep.
In fact, you said the boilers may have been defective when it started. How many successful voyages had it made prior to this accident?
Not many. It was built in January, and its first trip was in February to Wheeling. And this was in April, so it hadn't made a lot of trips. But those boats were notorious for blowing up. One of the stories that I included in the speech that really struck me was there were a group of women on board the Sultana who, they were like the Salvation Army, I think. They were kind of there to help the prisoners and to nurse them, to sort of take care of them. And I think there were, if I remember right, there were like 10 of them. And at one point, the water was just a churning mass of men pulling each other down, and this woman stood on the deck and she begged them to calm down, and just the sound of her voice, they did calm down. So a lot of them survived. Meanwhile, all 3 decks had burnt to the waterline. Her skirts caught on fire, and they watched her burn. There were children on board as well, and they put a life jacket on a little girl upside down, so that her feet were in the air and her head was in the water and she drowned. There's stories like that all through these books that are just, to me, and there were heroes, you know, there were guys who were saving other guys, and when they didn't need to, they should have been looking out for themselves, and they were trying to save people they didn't even know. And imagine spending the night in a treetop, naked, in the night, with men you don't know, and they were laughing and whistling and calling back and forth to each other in the trees. You know, that's how resilient these men were. I can't get over it. Mel?
What does the name Sultana mean?
That's a good question. I have no idea. Is a sultana a female sultan, or is it a raisin? Is it a raisin?
Do you know, did it say anywhere where what the depth of the river was at that point?
No, actually, I don't remember reading how deep it was, but I do know for sure that I read at one point, and I remember telling Ed Phillips this. I said, they said they were going to swim to shore, and the shore was 3 miles away. I said, the Mississippi's not that wide. Well, it is in flood. And on both sides, it was flooded, you know, miles and miles. So no matter which side you went to, can you go back to one of the maps, whether you went to Arkansas or the other side, Tennessee, is that right? You were in flood. So, you know, it was no choice at all. Hobbs' choice, is that what they call it? Yeah. Yeah.
A little bit on the explosion. We had a tractor explode, a steam tractor a few years back. I don't know if you recall that. But if the water level gets low and parts of the boiler aren't covered with water, they get extremely hot. And if that water hits that, it flashes off the steam and it can really cause an explosion.
Yeah, I know.
And that's
But
probably-
before I forget, there's two things I want to say. First one is, in the government investigation, they said the boilers were dry, and that wasn't true. The chief engineer checked them when he went to bed at midnight. The second engineer who came on that watch checked them and they were okay. They said in the investigation also that the men had caused the water to leave the boilers by moving in the boat, not at 2 o'clock in the morning. They were asleep if they could find a place to lie down, and most couldn't. The other thing I didn't say in the speech is where they actually found this boat in about 1992, I think it was. We think it was. There was an article in National Geographic about it. It was found in a cornfield on the Arkansas side, and it had $15,000 in gold in a safe in the hull, and they never found that. But one of the most interesting things to me was all the livestock on board, especially the mules and horses. The pigs, I think they offloaded, but they still had mules and horses. And so the guys on the river tried to ride these horses to the shore, and the horses drowned. You know, even the horse, because of the current, it was so strong. So somebody last night described it as the perfect storm. The river's in flood, the boat's overloaded, the boilers have a poor design. The perfect storm.
I doubt if they had the safety devices on the boilers that they have today.
There was none of the books I read didn't mention any lifeboats either. No such thing.
Yeah, and last night, John Bowman, who's quite an expert on the riverboats, told us that particular boiler design was later banned or outlawed because it was a faulty design, and that there had been numerous of them that had blown up, both before and after.
That's why I was going to say there were tubular boilers in here, and the Missouri, which blew up a month or so earlier, that had a relative of the Phillips on it, was the same kind. There was another one the same kind a month before. So the Sultana was the explosion that caused them to ban tubular boilers.
Wow.
Does anyone else have a question? Well, then I'll thank you for coming. I appreciate your attention.
Lunch with books. Lunch with books has Pepsi, Haxi, Fraxi, yells and sings, rocks and swings, pouring Tony, lunch with books. Lunch with books. At the Ohio County Public Library in Wheeling, West Virginia. It'll make you feel like yoga. Hey, mostly on Tuesdays at noon. Bring your lunch, we'll provide the pot. And it's all free. Lunch with